Hello and welcome to our June session of GSA's Client Enrichment Series Workplace WIFM tool. For today's presentation, WIFM is short for Workplace Investment and Feasibility Modeling, and not what's in it for me, but today there is a lot in it for you. My name is James Fotopoulos, and I will be your host today. I'm a Regional Account Manager from PBS Region 6 out of Kansas City, and it's my pleasure to participate in today's presentation. Today's session will be presented by Ryan Dorfler. Ryan assists federal agencies in identifying workplace arrangements that support employee work practices and achieve agency business goals. Past client agencies include FAA, HHS, and DHS. Ryan also teaches a workplace strategy class called Leading Workplace Engagements, as well as develops tools, publications that GSA employees and other federal agencies can use to further their workplace programs. His most recent tool is the Workplace Investment and Feasibility Modeling tool known as WIFM. Before I turn the presentation over to Ryan, I'd like to share a few housekeeping instructions. We have automatically muted your audio today to help us control the sound quality of the presentation. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the chat pane located on the right side of your screen. Type your question or comment in the box, and it can be viewed by our fellow attendees and our team. We hope to encourage an interactive dialogue using this feature as we try to address as many questions as possible during the session today. If you prefer to suppress the chat feature, you can click on the four-headed arrow at the upper right-hand corner of your presentation to maximize the slides on your screen. And this is very important today because Ryan will not only have slides but also a demo. So if you're having trouble seeing the demo, make sure and hit that four-headed arrow feature there, and that will expand your screen. So that is very important today. We'll do our best to answer all your questions today, but if we run out of time, all questions will be captured on a formal Q&A document and sent to all participants prior to our next presentation. In about 3 weeks after our session, the slide deck session, recording, and Q&A documents will be posted to our website at www.gsa.gov/CES. With that, I will turn it over to our presenter.
Great, thank you, James. Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you good.
Great, thank you. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Ryan Dorfler. I'm a workplace strategist with the Total Workplace Program Management Office within the Public Building Service. And what my office does is we basically provide workplace consulting services and advice to other federal agencies, as well as provide workplace strategy tools, of which one of them I'm going to be covering today called the Workplace Investment and Feasibility Modeling, or WIFM, tool. WIFM is essentially, it's a scenario planning tool, and what it does is it produces future workplace scenarios based off of some basic information about the current workplace. What WIFM does is will allow you, and also allows our GSA project teams, to test various workplace strategies relative to space policies. So for instance, if your agency is going through a significant space reduction or has to achieve a certain utilization rate goal, what WIFM allows our project teams to do is to try different scenarios before the requirements have been developed to see what types of workplace strategies possibly might work in a hypothetical setting. So some of the scenarios or features that the user can play with in developing those scenarios is changing the size and allocation of various individual workspaces. By that I mean workstations and enclosed offices. Also seeing the cumulative impact of desk sharing participation rates and ratios, as well as changing the mix of standard support spaces. By that I mean like meeting rooms, open meeting tables, and the more standard storage rooms. From those strategies that are produced in WIFM, WIFM will then create a rough order of magnitude estimate associated with that cost of workplace change. The level of estimating would be most akin to a feasibility or screening estimate, which is those that you would typically see if they're being produced where your requirements are pretty much haven't been really defined yet. So let's say the 0 to 5% of the project has been defined. So because we're at that point in the project pipeline, Where the requirements hasn't been defined, what WIFM needs is some basic information about the current workplace and able to generate some meaningful scenarios. The nice thing about WIFM, which I'll be demonstrating a little bit later on during this session, is from these scenarios, someone can use the workplace strategies that were explored as the basis for further development when it comes time to develop those requirements. It also helps to influence the direction of the concepts. So where WIFM is typically used is early on in the project pipeline before the feasibility assessments have been created. Or another point that is a good point to use is when GSA is engaging you in developing the CPA as part of the requirements development or at the start of the requirements development process, WIFM would be a good tool to use early on to explore potential workplace strategies that would allow you to further explore it during the programming stages of the project. So what I'm going to do next is explore a little bit more the scenarios that are covered by WIFM. And to help me do that, I'm going to use an example project, or client rather, where they have three offices in 3 different locations. One of the neat features about WIFM is it allows you to explore the consolidation of up to 3 different locations regardless of where they're at in the country. So let's say location 1 is in California, location 2 is in Phoenix, Arizona, and location 3 is in Reno, Nevada. What WIFM will do is take into account those localities, apply a locality adjustment to the rough order of magnitude tenant improvement estimates. And let's say that these 3 locations, this agency is exploring the possibility of co-locating them to Maui, Hawaii, then it would apply the locality adjustment associated with Maui. So to help illustrate how those scenarios works, what I'm going to do is use these 3 example locations. You see location 1 on the left is predominantly private offices with a very little amount of open work areas, including workstations or open meeting tables. They practically don't have any types of other standard support, and there's some special support spaces. Let's say it's a secured environment, maybe like a SCIF or a server room, for instance. Locations 2 and 3, on the other hand, are very similar to each other. The primary difference being is that the location 3 has a little bit less special support spaces than location 2, and the distribution of the more standard support spaces are a little bit different as well. Now, using these 3 locations as an example, what WIFM does is it produces first a baseline scenario. And the baseline scenario is, what if we did nothing? This is the classic do nothing scenario. And in this particular instance, in each of these 3 locations, and in this particular scenario, the assumption is that every person, wherever they're assigned, will stay at that particular location. What it also does is what WIFM, because the workplace isn't changing, but we still want to see the cost impact associated with the continued occupancy, what WIFM will do is provide a rough order of magnitude tenant improvement estimate associated with minimally refreshing that space. And we're not just talking about the offices and workstations and even the meeting rooms. We're also talking about the rough order of magnitude estimate associated with minimally refreshing the special spaces as well, such as the SCIFs and the server rooms. Now, this is used as WIFM as a baseline for the comparison of the other scenarios. And as it says there, it really is demonstrating what if we did nothing and what is the cost associated with it, as well as obviously the space doesn't change. The first scenario that WIFM allows you to manipulate relates to what if we only change the workstations, and what would that look like? Now, unlike this example here or the illustrations where there's floor drawings and you can see the distribution of the workstations, WIFM is all it does is it calculates the numbers, and it treats the workstation area as one total. What it does is in this scenario, on the workstation changes only scenario, the assumption still is that personnel stay at their respective locations. There's no movement of personnel in between them. And the workstation areas are rebuilt with new furniture. And in each of these scenarios, the rough order of magnitude cost not only includes the tenant improvement cost associated with the build-out of those spaces, but also includes furniture cost as well. So in this particular instance, what WIFM is calculating in the cost estimate portion is minimally refreshing all of the non-workstation spaces, and then it takes into account the cost of building out the area where the workstation is at, as well as the cost of putting in the new furniture. Now, unlike what we see here, and as far as especially in locations 2 and 3, where the workstations are sprinkled throughout the workplace, what WIFM does not do is take into account the distribution of where those workstations are, or things like floor plate efficiency and that kind of thing. Those are very unique to the project, and WIFM is used before the project's really been defined. So when we get into the demo and we see the numbers and we see square footage reductions and that kind of thing, we're only talking about the cumulative totals of the total workstation area. Now, this scenario will be most typically used for on a project. Let's say you're in a lease location and you got a couple years left and you want to try some novel workstation types of furniture, or just test out, do like a pilot project, for instance. WIFM could help you test out what type of space reduction could be achieved in that particular instance. The next scenario deals more with a more dramatic workplace change. And in this particular instance, called the office renovation scenario, what WIFM does is it takes into account a complete change of the workplace with the exception of the special support spaces. This is a pretty common scenario where, particularly if you're in a federal building and your occupancy in the federal building isn't going to change, yet you want to look at releasing some space and you're willing to take out the walls associated with the offices and the meeting rooms. Very often, the special support spaces like server rooms will stay the same because it just ends up being too cost prohibitive to change them. So the office renovation scenario is the type of scenario that would be right for there. As you see here, it is a much more robust change. The nice thing about this one is you're not nearly as limited to, let's say, the workstation changes only scenario here, where you're only focusing on just the workstations and you have to think about how they're distributed around the workplace. In the office renovation scenario, everything that's colored there in this particular instance is wiped away and rebuilt anew based off of the scenarios that are produced in WIFM. The last scenario that's produced in WIFM is a total workplace change, and this is particularly appealing for those projects where you're looking at co-locations. Now, WIFM will allow you to enter in, it captures data relative to 3 different locations, regardless of where they are in the United States. And you can explore the possibility of merging them into one location. However, it is capped at 3. It doesn't take into account 4 or 5, or definitely not more than that, largely because WIFM is an Excel-based tool, and adding each location greatly increases the complexity of the calculations behind the scenes of WIFM. So 3 seem like the sweet spot when it comes to consolidation. And what WIFM does is assumes everybody is moving to the new location. All the spaces, including the special spaces, can basically be rebuilt anew. The key difference between the 2 scenarios when it comes to the rough order of magnitude cost estimates is that the one in the previous example, the office renovation, does take into account demolition, while in total workplace change, the assumption is that it's going into a warm lit shell. So these are the 3 scenarios that WIFM allows the user to manipulate. And what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about the kind of information that's needed. Now, WIFM is used before requirements have been developed, but it needs some sort of information in order to allow the user to create these scenarios. And so what I've done is looked at the types of data that's available for the current workplace and created some business rules within WIFM that adjust the calculation to create these scenarios. The first type of information is needed is related to the project itself. Some basic information like the agency name and the project name. These are used for identification purposes throughout the WIFM tool. It needs to know the location, geographic location of where that future workplace will be. This is that white box on the bottom right, and when it comes to total workplace change. And again, what this is used for is to be able to apply a locality adjustment as well as a seismic adjustment as well to the rough order of magnitude tenant improvement cost estimates. Other information that's needed is relative to utilization rate goals. You do have the ability of putting an all-in and an administrative office utilization rate goal from which you can track your scenarios against. However, at this time, we don't have agency-specific utilization rates. I know many of you out there have your own way of calculating utilization rate, but that is on the top of the to-do list for the next version of WIFM, and something I want to talk about at the end of this presentation when it talks about customizing WIFM for each of your agencies. And then it also captures, needs some basic information about headcount in the future, because of course that's used in the calculations when it comes to space. What WIFM also needs is some basic information about each of the current locations, and we would put this in from each time for, if you have 3 locations, then it would be put in 3 times. If it's only 2, then only 2 times, and so forth. It needs to know the number of locations, the building names, again, for identification purposes, the geographic location, again, so it can apply the appropriate locality adjustment. And then what it needs is the very rough area, total area of workstations, office, and some of the support spaces, and it needs to know what special spaces currently exist. And I'll talk about that in a little bit in a second. And so based off of this information, and really when we talk about areas, I am not talking about exact areas that have been recently measured or need to be measured. I'm talking about very approximate numbers, and WIFM takes into account that fuzziness of the figures in the calculations, because again, these are rough order of magnitude calculations. Now what I'm going to do next is talk about, just provide a brief glimpse of what WIFM is and what it looks like. With the dashboard looks like this, and it's quite busy, I can admit that, and the colors certainly are bright. And it's at this particular moment you may want to, if you haven't done so already, is expand that the presentation portion of your window pane using the 4 directional arrows that James mentioned. What I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on each of these sections and talk about, what WIFM does. The first part is the more classic identification information, what the project is. You'll see there I put in a fictional agency called the U.S. Complaints Department. It's a case study that I use in my workplace strategy classes, and so that way we're not focusing on one particular agency or even ourselves. So in this instance, the fictional agency of the U.S. Complaints Department, this is a scenario that I ran for them. And you see some basic identification information up there, and you also see a jump to box. One of the things about WIFM is even though it is an Excel tool, there's a built-in navigation feature, so the average user won't need to click on the Excel tabs at all. You are able to run up to 3 different scenarios independently of each other and compare that against a baseline. So in each of these, within each of these scenarios, you also have the ability to choose between the 3 scenarios that I talked about earlier using those example floor plans. So you see there in green, there is the baseline, do nothing, no workplace change scenario. Then in blue, it's the scenario related to changing only the workstations. The purplish pink color is office renovation, where again, the 3 locations are staying in place, but we're doing a more dramatic workplace change. And then scenario 3, which is the more salmon pink color, is where all 3 current locations merge into a brand new location, and everything changes, including the special support spaces. Now, within each of these scenarios, and you can, to go back 1 second, and within each of these scenarios, the blue, purple, and pink, you can choose from any of the 3 scenarios. So you can have each of these side-by scenarios be all workstation changes only, or you can have each of these scenarios be all total workplace change only. And you can subtly change the variables within each of those scenarios and compare the cumulative impact side by side. And you do have the ability of hiding a scenario. So in a more webinar setting, if you only want to focus on scenarios 2 and 3, because, or sorry, 1 and 2, because 3 is getting chopped off on the screen, there is a way of doing that. Now, the features, the variables that you can manipulate within each scenario are this. The first one pertains to the desk sharing participation rate and the desk sharing ratio for federal employees. And now, one of the assumptions that is built into here, and when it comes to headcount and capturing information, is that federal employees can participate in a desk sharing program while non-federal employees don't. And that's one of the business rules that's factored into here. So with this, you can see the impacts associated with, well, what happens if we increase the ratio of number of people per seat, but don't change the number of people who are participating in the desk sharing program. Or what happens if we keep the seats per person per seat the same, or increase or lower the participation rate. And this, by manipulating this, you can see the impacts down below, which we'll get into in a second. The next variable you can change in WIFM is the average workstation size that's applied across the entire organization. Now, WIFM is not a programming tool. It is not intended to capture each individual's workstation size or each position's workstation or office size. So when we talk about average, we're really talking just that across the entire organization. You'll see there in green is that the averages there are averages that we put in on the input screens, which I'm not going to really cover just in the interest of time. But then you see in the scenarios 1, 2, and 3, the blue, purple, and pink, you do have drop-down selection boxes where you can adjust the workstation size. Here you see a bunch of 8 by 8, 64 net square feet workstations, with scenario 3 with an 8 by 10 or 80 net square feet workstation size. The next scenario variable that you can manipulate when it comes to the office renovations and the total workplace changes, because in each of those scenarios we're getting rid of the offices and the meeting rooms, we're doing more dramatic changes in the workplace, what it does is it opens up another possibility for manipulating the scenario. What I've done is allowed the user to not only specify what % of the federal population gets the first workstation size, but also creates the opportunity where the user can specify that for the balance of the federal employees, do they get offices or do they get another workstation type, and whatever that happens to be able to select an average size for those. So you see in scenario 2 in location 1, the 90% of the population is going to be getting 8 by 8 workstations, while the remaining 10% of the federal population will get offices of the 10 to 15 foot size. Conversely, in locations 2, the mix of federal employees on the first workstation is a little bit different at 75%, with the remaining 25% of the population, federal population, getting another workstation type, which happens to also be 8 by 8s, but you can choose that to be 6 by 8 workstations or 8 by 10s. There is a lot of choices within each of those. Now, if you decide that everyone in a single location, like location 3 everyone gets the same workstation size on average, you can just say 100%, and you'll notice that the choice of a second work type has been hidden. Through one of the features throughout WIFM is that we'll automatically hide those entry points that aren't needed based off of the inputs that the user has previously put in. What it also does is when it comes to the input screens, it will automatically skip those screens that aren't needed depending on the variables that you've also put in on the current screen or the previous one. So there's a lot of built-in navigation and features that makes it look like a web page when it really isn't. All it is an Excel document. And you'll notice that those features, when it comes to the second workstation type or workstation type 2 or office, are not available in scenario 1. That's because we are bounded by the overall area of the workstations, and our selection is much more limited. The last variable that one can manipulate comes to the standard support spaces. And rather than have the user go through a very long list of support spaces, such as meeting rooms of various shapes and sizes, open meeting tables, break areas, that kind of thing, what I've done is I created 3 buckets of standard support spaces where each one has a different mix depending on which basically supports a different level of overall interaction in the organization. And so there is a high, average, and a low. The high interaction, which you see there on the right in scenario 3, is an organization which has a lot of movement within it, a lot of team meetings, and basically people are away from their desk quite a bit, and they're going to need a bit more standard support space in meeting and collaboration areas than, let's say, the low interaction, which isn't shown here, where low interaction is an organization that may be at their desk a lot and don't need as many meeting rooms. And then the average interaction, admittedly, would be the one that the user would most likely use, which has a more middle of the road. And in each of those, it has, when you select that, it will pick the mix of standard support spaces that is appropriate for that. And I mean just standard support spaces. Things like special support spaces like SCIFs and server rooms, there are places in WIFM that captures that, and then those are rolled into the space calculations as well separately. The overall types of information that's output by WIFM consists of space relative, what is the cumulative impact of those changes and the variables, and how does it, what does the resulting space overall area look like. There's various warning screens that are labels that you see there, like in the workstation changes only scenario, what's happened in this particular scenario. The overall area of total usable square feet exceeds the amount of space that we currently have, and because we can't expand the size of the building, this is a warning label saying we need to make some adjustment to make it work within the boundaries of what our buildings are. What also is input on the space side is calculations relative to the two utilization rates that are already built in. There's an all-in utilization rate calculation as well as an administrative office utilization rate calculation. And what that is it's basically the same as the all-in minus the special support spaces. Now, if the user chooses not to put in a goal for this, there's no comparison against that goal, and these are basically shaded out, if you will. These are the roll-up outputs relative to space, and you'll see next to the shaded totals, little dots in yellow that are bounded by a colored box. In each of those instances, and you'll see this down below also when we get into cost estimating, when you click on those dots, those go to the much more detailed calculations, which I hope to show you when we get into the demo part of this presentation. At the bottom band there of outputs relates to the rough order of magnitude estimated costs. You'll see that covers tenant improvements, furniture, equipment for the special spaces that have been changed, technology for the changed spaces only and excluding service costs, and consulting services as it relates to workplace strategy and change management. And each of those has a different types of estimating approach, which I want to cover briefly as well. The way WIFM calculates the rough order of magnitude cost estimate, depending on the space type and how it's manipulated in the scenario, it pulls up a different type of data. In the instance of tenant improvements, which is probably the one that everyone is most interested in, what it does is it references source data from a repair and alteration unit cost study that GSA uses also to inform other things like building evaluation reports, project needs assessments, and those type of project scoping documents, where the level of project definition is similarly limited, if you will. The estimating method is comparable to what's used in the GCCRG, so if you've worked on prospectus projects, you're kind of familiar with this. However, the key difference is, even though we use the same technique, the key difference is that the GCCRG is based off of some sort of requirement from the client agency, while WIFM is based off of data off of the current workplace and not the client requirement. And of course, costs, again, are adjusted for locality. When it comes to special support spaces like the SCIFs and server rooms, the user has the ability of selecting from the universe of special spaces that are preloaded into WIFM, where we do have that tenant improvement source data, or the user also has the option of creating another space, in which case the user will be asked to provide the unit cost per square foot to either minimally refresh or build out that space, depending on the scenario. When it comes to furniture costs, we've preloaded in some contract costs, average contract costs from our FIT contracts, and filled in the gaps with other types of estimates. When it comes to equipment, those spaces for workstations, offices, and particularly standard support like kitchenettes, the cost for equipment, anything that's built in has already been preloaded as part of the tenant improvement costs. And the same goes for technology on the standard support spaces. When it comes to workstations and offices, there is a unit cost for soft phones for those stations, individual workspaces that are changing only. And when it comes to special support spaces, because WIFM doesn't know what special support spaces are being entered, and there's always the possibility of a unique special support being entered, there is an entry screen that asks the user to put in furniture and equipment technology for those special spaces. What's nice about WIFM is because it's an Excel document, you don't have to complete everything. You can always save it in draft. And if furniture, equipment, or technology is going to be reused in a special space, it's very simple just to put in zeros in those values, and WIFM will take that into account. Those figures that are entered into the special support are essentially just passed through into the outputs. When it comes to workplace consulting, for workplace strategy consulting services, it's a cost per square foot. When it comes to change management services, it's a cost per person, with those unit costs adjusting depending on the complexity of the project and the scope of workplace change that is going down. And basically it goes up in the total workplace change scenario, or the unit cost will go down if it's only in the workstation changes only scenario, because the amount of workplace change is more limited. So you'll see that there's a variety of different cost estimate sources and different ways of manipulating it. The green are those where the average user can directly impact how the calculations. The yellows are those where, should you decide you're interested in WIFM being customized for your agency, this is where we can have a conversation about that. And then the reds are those that are pretty much locked into the tool and an integral part of it. Because WIFM doesn't use actual requirements for the client, and it's very limited and bases their scenarios on a number of assumptions, what it is, there are some limitations on its use. It is not intended to be used as a programming document, and when we get into this, show you the details of it a little bit more in the demo and in the last part of the session, you'll see why. But the main reason is it uses makes a number of assumptions related to allocation ratios and sizes. And because of that, and because of the cost estimating methodology that's used, WIFM is particularly lousy for use in a government estimate or used to substantiate the amount in an RWA or a budget amount. It is not based off of the actual requirements that a client agency would like to see fulfilled in this particular project. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and unshare the screen, and actually I'm going to do something a little bit different, Andre, in the interest of time. I'm going to go through the last couple of slides, and then I'll bounce over to the demo, and that way the transition will be a little bit easier. So I've got a few more slides, and then we'll go over to the demo. One of the things I want to bring up, where briefly, and we go through the demo maybe to think about it, is when I created WIFM, I built it in a way, the structure, so that way the parts are more flexible, nimble, if you will. And so there are a variety of different ways where it can be customized to the unique needs of each of your agencies. There are some built-in customization features. One of them relates to the workstation names and sizes. You'll see when I use the demo that there's drop-down menus where it relates to workstation names and sizes. Same goes for offices as well. If your agency uses a particular size or likes to have things named a certain way, WIFM can be very easily customized to do that. You can even customize that on your own. I have some built-in expert screens that allows the user to do that. And same goes for when it comes to the standard support space sizes. When it comes to name, sizes, and descriptions, there are some built-in descriptions into the tool. You can change those descriptions for like a meeting room, for instance, and those will automatically be repopulated throughout WIFM. And the same thing goes for furniture cost estimates. I think many of you already have contracts in place to provide furniture, like workstations and offices and meeting tables. If you would like WIFM customized for you, we can import those, basically those average furniture costs into WIFM, and that will further refine the scenarios that WIFM produces. Now, there are a couple different ways that can be customized also, but more from a development perspective, which basically entails me having a conversation with your agency, going through kind of the insides of WIFM and seeing what's possible without breaking it. The first one goes to utilization rate calculations. This one's pretty straightforward, where if you want, and I see there's a question about DHS, space tool, which I'll get actually right after the end of this particular slide. And DHS has a certain way of calculating utilization rate. We can put in the DHS way of calculating utilization rate into the tool, and that one is actually pretty straightforward. What we can also do is preload in special spaces. So if you don't like the universe of names and you have a different way of doing your special spaces, and you know the minimal refresh and TI cost for minimal refresh and build out, that's something we can have a conversation as well. It largely depends on what you're looking at and making sure that it's compatible with the calculation methodologies that's within WIFM. The other thing we can do also is if you want to create a WIFM tool that for a universe or a set of types of properties, if you have a bunch of properties across the country, locations, and they're all comparably similar, and you want to put in, sort of preload in some special support spaces, and you know what the cost of the furniture, equipment, technology might be, and you know that they're always going to change, that's something we can have a conversation with as well. So there are lots of different ways of customizing it. To address the question about the DHS space calculation tool, which coincidentally I developed as well, it cannot be imported into WIFM yet, but that is certainly a conversation I would love to have with DHS to sort of explore that potential. So I think, and then coincidentally, there it is, connection to other space calculation tools. Yes, that's something that I'd be more than happy to explore if anyone is interested in that. A large part of it is what your expectations of what that calculation tool, what you want to keep on doing as compared to WIFM, because one of them is based off of actual requirements and really gets into the micro aspects of those requirements. When it comes to WIFM, it's looking at things much more strategically and establishing that more tactical to strategic connection can be tricky depending on the details of what that connection looks like. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the demo. And
hey Ryan, while you're switching over to your demo, we did have a question in the chat pane about federal versus leased. So you've got a couple scenarios you can do. Is there a difference between federal and leased while using this tool?
Right now, there is not. It basically is building agnostic. The earlier versions I did play with, so we have like a space output module, we have calculation, we have a cost estimate output module. I did play with the idea of doing like a rent output module, which took into account the tenant improvement allowance and compared the costs associated with that and that kind of thing. And in the interest of getting WIFM out the door, I took away the rent one, but that is also at the top of the list as far as the 2.0 version of it. And that's something I'm going to explore pretty much early next year after we get this one out and do a little bit more using it. So when I develop 2.0, I can basically cover everything that needs to be covered. So it's not in there now. It's definitely something of interest and definitely something I want to put into the next version of the tool.
And you probably have this in your slide deck, maybe towards the end, but if somebody wanted to get access to this tool, or
the way to get access of the tool at this time is this is a very high-level overview of the tool. There's a lot of things that the average user needs to understand about how things are calculated, which requires a much more in-depth orientation session. So if someone is interested in this tool, an agency is, all they need to do is contact me, and we would have that deeper discussion, and at which point I would provide a copy of the tool. But for right now, I'm not doing a mass distribution of it because it's much easier to go through the deeper review of it and then provide a copy of it at that time. And when we do the demo, I think people will get a sense of that.
All right. And I think you addressed, as far as importing the tool or linking it up to other tools, I think you addressed that. That was kind of one of your wants in the future.
Yes,
so,
yeah, and it really depends on the details of what that particular client agency is interested in. And again, they can contact me directly, and I'd be happy to have those discussions.
All right, I think you addressed all the questions, so I think we're good to go for the demo.
All right, excellent. So what you should see on your screen is an Excel document. At the top, this one is demo version. You'll see the classic Excel ribbon. When you do ever get the tool, if we have a conversation and you open it, you'll see there is a lot of tabs at the bottom. The nice thing about WIFM is the average user can pretty much ignore them. What I've done is I built in a navigation feature into this. And what I'm going to do is actually go to full screen mode. It's a little bit easier to see. And I've tried to zoom in on each of these screens, so it's a little bit easier. But if you haven't already, I still recommend expanding your preview or viewing pane just so you can really see what's going on. So when you first open, or the user first open up WIFM, just the template file, the blank WIFM file, they'll see this massive warning label on there saying what it is and what it shouldn't be used for, as well as my contact information. By clicking Start Now, what happens is that WIFM will automatically route the user to a variety of input screens. In here, you see that it's asking for some basic information about the organization. I've preloaded all the screens in the interest of time and to avoid me embarrassing myself with spelling errors. You'll see that some fields are required, which is denoted by an asterisk next to the field name, and some are not. And so what happens is, in this instance, organization and project name are entered in. You can specify a number of locations. I'm doing 2. This is where we would put in the state and the city associated with the future location. And these fields here are used for the locality adjustment on the future location scenario. In here, we would enter in the utilization rate for the goal that we want to see for the all-in and the administrative office utilization rate. Again, this would be something where if we wanted to customize this for your particular agency, we could add in or swap out one of these for your own agency utilization rate measurement. And this is just a matter of going in there and changing how the formula calculates things. What you'll see in the top right is this pumpkin orangish color on select next screen. What this is the navigation feature, which allows the user to jump to the next screen, or if they've moved along, go back a screen, and then also at any point they can go to the dashboard and see what's going on. Okay? Over here, it allows the user to jump back to where they were before, and you'll notice that I'm not touching the tabs at all. So in this instance, after I put in the initial setup screen, it's going to ask me for some information about the current space. And there is a little bit of information here. What I'm going to do is highlight a little bit what's needed, and then if you're interested in a more detailed focus, I can zoom in on that. Basically, what it's asking for is organization building name, city and state again, about the current location, and this is where it asks for what type of information does the user have or can get to relatively easy. Usable area is used when the person filling this out has no idea how the space is distributed, and they just basically have a gut sense of how it's roughly distributed. That's all that's needed for WIFM. So in this particular instance that I preloaded, the user has decided, like, well, there's roughly about 44% of the total area is open workstations, and roughly about 28%, give or take, is for enclosed offices. That is the level of accuracy that WIFM needs. It doesn't need to be more accurate than that. It can be that rough. So in this instance, with the usable area only, that selection, what we're doing is we're taking a rough guess based off of a percentage, and as part of that, we're automatically sort of figuring in the circulation as well. But WIFM does need these overall figures to break it up, basically break it apart and rebuild some of them when it comes to producing the scenarios. So we need a rough idea of what the total area is for open workstations and enclosed offices. We also need to get the average workstation and office sizes as well. Again, this doesn't have to be the exact number. It's just a rough number, so that way WIFM can do its rough order of magnitude calculations. In this particular instance, we identify what percent of the population is currently desk sharing. If we did put in a number, it would automatically hide, and then we can choose what number people per seat, roughly speaking, that they're currently is the desk sharing program. In this standard support space section, it's asking also for the rough area for the meeting rooms, kitchen and break areas, and other standard support. You might think these categories are a little bit odd. The reason why they're like that is because they map over to that tenant improvement source cost estimating data, and this is how we need it as subtotal so it can do those minimal refresh calculations for you. Now, there's 2 ways of entering in special support spaces, things like SCIFs, high-density files, all that kind of fun stuff. One of them is utilizing what's been preloaded into WIFM here, or you can just go through, or you can say, well, actually, I want a laboratory or a law enforcement. Basically, every single type of space that, oh, I'm sorry, I just lost connection, and I'm going back in again. There we go. And basically, every type of space that GSA is familiar with is preloaded into here, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and do that as, I think I said, laboratory, and then the dry lab, and I'm going to do 1,000 square feet. Now, for the special spaces that you choose on this screen, WIFM will automatically find the appropriate unit costs for the tenant improvement portion of things. If your agency happens or the user feels that the spaces here is too limiting and they want to put in their own amount, they can do so here at the bottom. In this case, I put a really unique GSA space in. Now, unfortunately, the downside of doing that is when you put in this space, it's going to ask what is the intended improvement allowance for minimally refreshing that space. And if I did WIFM right, there it is. The next screen asks what is that cost of minimally refreshing it. Now, for many people, they may not know what it is, and they don't really have access to a cost estimator to do that. So what I've done at the bottom is provided a reference table, rounded, very much rounded, because there's some proprietary cost estimating information in here, and I actually introduced a little bit of randomness in these values as well to reinforce the rough order of magnitude aspect of it. But I also did apply, on the flip side, apply a locality adjustment on top of those as well. So in this instance, you see in the notes that the locality adjustment is for San Francisco, California, and this reference table takes all these unit costs, includes certain things, and exclude other things. So what the user can do is say, well, my really unique GSA space is very similar to a wet lab, but it doesn't have these types of things, so let's just call it 40-ish dollars per usable square feet. That is the level of accuracy that WIFM needs, is really more in the ish side of things, or more like a plus or minus 10 to 20%, if you will. Once I put this in for the first location, then I would do the same thing for the second location, because we have two locations. And in this instance, I happen to have a detailed space program, so this gets into the question about can I connect it to a space like the DHS space calculation tool or another space programming tool. There sort of is a way. We just need to have a more deeper discussion, because in this instance, I do have the detailed numbers associated with net area and circulation. And because I do have those detailed numbers, what's also going to ask me is for roughly what the circulation area is. And really, that's just the total net area minus the usable area. So it's really about just plugging in a number here until the usable area adds up to what the real usable area is. What WIFM does with the circulation area is automatically back it out to get a rough idea what the circulation multiplier should be, and then this number is applied back into the scenarios, particularly when it comes to the workstation changes only scenario, because we can't forget about the circulation on those calculations. And because I didn't put anything in here in the non-WIFM spaces, what WIFM will do, and all the special spaces are just here on the preloaded ones, what WIFM will do is automatically let me skip that, and now it's going to ask me some questions about what to do in the new location. So this is all current workplace stuff. It doesn't know, and the assumption is in the current workplace, any change that's going on, these spaces will stay the same, and the only thing we really need to apply on here is the cost of minimally refreshing them. But if the locations are moving to a new location or a new location, then WIFM needs to know what special spaces are needed. Up here you'll see on this screen, there's two screens very similar to each other. The first one deals with those that have been preloaded into WIFM. You'll see at the top those that we put in for the current locations, and what I've done is added in little check boxes, so as you go through it, as a way of not forgetting which ones are left. Over here is a little work area. Admittedly, it was to take up some white space below the navigation, and this is just a way of just doing some quick calculations if you wanted to do so, and don't have a calculator on hand. That's all it is. This does not feed anything. This is just here as something hopefully that's useful. And then what the user would do is think about what special spaces are needed in the future using the same type of selection, looking at the type of space. And some of these are entered in multiple times. So if, like in storage, you'll see that it includes a SCIF, a secured storage SCIF type. But if you go to secured areas, it will also have a secured storage SCIF type. So what I've done is group these different types of special support spaces into different categories, sometimes multiple times. And then what WIFM will do is automatically calculate the rough order of magnitude unit cost for tenant improvement for building out this space in the new location. Similarly, what WIFM is going to do at the new location is ask me if I have any non-WIFM spaces. Even if I didn't put anything in the current locations, if these were all blanked out or zero, like no non-WIFM special spaces are here, it's still going to ask me just in case there is something new. So in this instance, GSA has a super duper secret space that's going to put in its new location in Maui. So then what happens after that is then once we put this in, WIFM needs to know what the tenant improvement cost is for that super duper secret space, just like before. We will put in a value here for a new build out at that location. And then what it would do is I also have a reference table just like before to help the user find out which one is the closest to it, and it also indicates the inclusions and exclusions of that number. After that's done, then the last thing that really has to do with special spaces, if we're creating special spaces at the new location, and some of them are basically preloaded WIFM ones and some of them are not, what WIFM needs to know is what is going to be the cost, total cost, of any new furniture, equipment, or technology. Now, the way the screen is worked out is it pulls up all the WIFM spaces that we've done in the previous screen, and below that it has all the non-WIFM spaces, and then every time there's an entry, there's a green box. I forgot to mention, everywhere there's a green box, that's an entry point. If the user doesn't know, they can leave it blank. If they're planning on reusing everything, you just put in a 0. Again, this is an Excel document, and you can always save it as a draft and reopen it and put in new information. After this is put in, the last number data that's put in is the future headcount. The way this works is federal personnel can share desks and can get offices, while non-federal personnel get desks, workstations at a 1-to-1 ratio, one person for every desk, but they can't get offices. And this is just another business rule added in to further refine things. Once that's done, then we're able to play with the scenarios. And in this instance, you'll see in the first scenario, we can select from a total workplace changes scenario. The bottom is blank because we haven't put in identified the variables yet. And I'm going to say 10% of the population is sharing a desk at 2-to-1. And in this instance, I'm going to do 6x8s in location 1 and 8x8s in location 2. And you'll see that everything is populated down below, with here being the workplace areas and here being the cost estimate. Green check marks means we're doing good. We either achieve the goal over here for utilization rate, or we're reducing our space over here. In the second scenario, what I'm going to do is show office renovation right here. Choose office renovation. I could do another workstation changes only if I wanted to, but I want to do office renovation. And in this instance, I'm going to do 25% of the federal population is just sharing at 2-to-1. In this instance, we're going to do 2 8x8s, and then for each location. And then I identify of the federal population. Now, contractors will always get at a 1-to-1 whatever the first workstation type is. And then you can say, well, 75% of the population, federal population, will get these, and we'll say 50 here. And in location 1, they're actually going to get another workstation type, maybe bigger ones. Actually, I'm going to change that to 8x8 and make these 6x8s. And then in location 2, they're going to get offices, maybe 10x15 offices. And because we're changing the entire workplace at each current location, we get to adjust the mix of standard support spaces. In this instance, they're kind of an antisocial group, and they sit at their desk a lot, and they don't need as much standard support spaces like meeting rooms, for instance. In the third scenario, what I'm going to do is show what a total workplace change looks like. Again, we're talking about first identify what % of the population is desk sharing. And in this instance, all of the locations are merging into a new location here. I'll put in some dummy figures. Let's say 100%. Everyone's getting 6x8s. You'll see that it's 100%, but actually I'm going to change that. 70% here in 70%, and then the other part are going to get some offices here, and then they get, we're going to do a high interaction. They move around a lot. And what this reflects is the total amount of everyone merging together. Now you'll see the last thing I want to cover before we get back into some questions is, okay, these numbers are great. They look nice and they're certainly brightly colored, but what do I do with them and how do I know that they're real? Next on these ... if you click these, what you'll see, and I'm going to do it on the new location, is it goes to a very detailed calculation, this instance in the very bright salmon pink, which breaks out the calculation line by line by line. So and then at the very top, you see some roll-up figures here, another summary table over here, And then what it also does is for each type of space, and here we have individual workspaces, it does it line by line as far as how it was calculated, the source of the data, whether it came in from another WIFM sheet or if it was buried from like a source estimate data, cost estimating data, and then it also indicates all of the formulas. In this way, nothing is hidden when it comes to the calculation. And it does this for every single space type, and I won't get into that. And you get the sense that it's going to be basically over and over again for the standard support spaces, and then also at the bottom comes the circulation calculations. I forgot to mention those spaces that we identified in the new workplace on those screens are picked up over here. Now, if we did this for 2 locations or 3 locations, it shows the same thing, but just shows it all side by side for each of the locations. When it comes for the cost estimating, what it does is it'll show it also as a summary table at the top. Sorry, I meant to scroll all the way up here before. And you'll see rough order of magnitude tenant improvement estimates, furniture, equipment, technology. And then for each of the cost estimates, because depending on the scenario, there's a different set of exclusions. In this instance, in every type of scenario, move services are excluded. Also, swing space is excluded. Some types of technology excluded as well, mainly because we have no idea what those costs would be without actually talking to the client or doing some sort of requirements discussion and knowing more about the project. The way tenant improvements are handled is handled a bit differently, and what I'm going to do is save that. If anybody's interested, I can address that in the questions. I'm seeing my nice little chat box popping up a little bit, and I want to make sure we do have some time for questions. But you can see that there is a lot of calculations here, that go on to do with the cost estimate. So that's pretty much WIFM in a nutshell. What I'm going to do is go ahead and stop sharing and go back to the screen and see if there's any questions. It looks like there were some questions there. And James, why don't you prompt those, because I saw some pop-ups and I wasn't quite sure which ones I need to address.
Sure, Ryan. One of the questions was if they wanted to share an output from WIFM with their management, is there like a report out or something that it generates, like a one-pager, anything like that?
That is a great question. I'm going to unshare and go back to WIFM. I should have just stayed in there. And I will stay on this. And what you can do is, well, this is Excel. What you can do is on these detailed screens, WIFM is locked, but there are different passwords. So in this particular instance, the passwords for the detailed sheets are something that I'm providing with the tool. It's just locked to make sure people doesn't accidentally delete anything, like a row, that kind of thing. But you can unlock this. The average user can unlock this. They can copy and paste everything here into another Excel sheet. They can save it as like a temp version and get into the guts of this and manipulate the numbers. So this is something, and it already has been formatted for printing as a PDF, so you can just print it as a PDF. There is no actual like executive report out function yet. That is a great idea, however, and that is something I'll add it to the 2.0 list, if you will.
All right, another question we have, does the tool break out move costs?
No, it does not cover move costs, because in order to do move costs, it will need to have a detailed idea or some idea of what is being moved and to where and how often. There's just too many variables that influence that calculation that I felt it would be better to leave it out rather than burden the user to have to figure it out. So no, it excludes move costs.
And something that when we were putting this presentation together, you had mentioned that this tool is not something that you can generate numbers and then immediately create an RWA.
That is correct. Yeah, this is not intended to come up with an estimate, even though it has all these great details to it here, and it shows all this. It has like, wow, this is a lot of numbers. It's got to be right type of thing. It isn't. Largely because when we get into the space calculations, I'm going to just scroll down a bit to things like open meeting areas. You'll see here that it's making an assumption that this organization needs an two-person open table for every 20 people. Well, that may or may not be the case. They may not want any of those. They may want more enclosed meeting rooms. They may want this entire mix of standard support spaces is based off of just 3 buckets. There's no real nuance to them. So it's for that reason, if anything, that this shouldn't be used for anything that's connected to actual requirements, like an RWA estimate. Now, with that said, what this is good for is saying, you can say, theoretically, we need to reach a goal of 150 usable square feet or 200 usable square feet per person for the utilization rate. You can play with these different scenarios up here to see which one works the best. And then when it comes to requirements development, you can say, okay, in this scenario, we're going to have to really think about some aggressive desk sharing, because I've kicked in some desk sharing up here, like in the total workplace change. Well, if I didn't do that, the utilization rate goes up, and let's say the offices and workstations and offices are okay, but you still haven't reduced the goal. This is the point where, like, well, maybe we need to start thinking about some desk sharing, so that way we can achieve our goal theoretically. So these are all theoretical, hypothetical scenario type planning, and this can help influence change management or figuring out what to focus on those requirements.
Another question we have, are the costs adjusted for locality?
Yes, the costs are adjusted for locality based off of, and I'm going to go ahead at the initial setup for, in the case of the future location, the city and the state, and if we change the state, the universe of cities changes. This is the same locality adjustment table that's used in our internal estimating. And if a city isn't listed, then you would just click an unspecified city. And then what it would do is it will automatically apply that as well. Actually, what I can do is show you, oops, sorry, I meant to go to the dashboard. I'm really trying hard not to use the tabs at the bottom. At the bottom of the tenant improvement estimate, what it also does is a locality adjustment factor, which includes seismic. So in this instance, it's only 1% for the unspecified city in Illinois, a design review cost, management, inspection cost. The reason why I put locality in there, despite the that it being a rough order of magnitude, is that you can run into big swings. I think I'll show it in the two locations real quick. In the locality adjustment, I'm sorry for scrolling so quickly. So like in this instance here, and I'm going to highlight it, the locality adjustments for San Francisco and Phoenix are very different from each other. So much so that it goes beyond the rough side of things. And that's why I put in the locality adjustment, because you can get those big swings on how things happen. Next question.
Let me check the chat. I think we've answered just about all the questions that have come through, and if there's some that come in after the presentation's over, or if people want to ask some more questions, feel free and give us a shout out for that. And then as far, and I think I asked this earlier, as far as accessing the tool, just email you directly?
Yes, please. They can email me. Well, there we go. You can email me on any questions or more interest. And my contact information there on the screen, it's ryan.dorfler@gsa.gov, which is always the preferred way and helps me keep track of things. But you can also call me as well at that cell number below.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to add, Ryan, before I close this out?
No, I just want to thank everybody for their time. I recognize we've gone over a few minutes, and that's about it.
All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Ryan Dorfler today for a superb presentation. I think we had a lot of good interaction with the slides and with the demo. And like you said, if you want to have access to this tool, go ahead and contact him. He's got his information there on the last slide, and then in the slides that we sent out, you'll have that as well. I'd also like to thank all of our clients who are able to join us today. Today's presentation will be put on our website, and also a YouTube closed caption video as well as a formal Q&A document for future reference on our website at www.gsa.gov/CES. If you go out to our YouTube videos, I was just checking it just now, if you just search Client Enrichment Series, you'll find our videos out there. Please give us a like, turn on notifications, and subscribe to our channel. That way when we upload these presentations, you'll get a notification. We'll also send you this information in a follow-up email message before our next presentation in the next series. As a reminder, we do have several slots open for our eRETA Summer Camp. with the next session on September 4th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. This session will provide background information on eRETA and a live demo on the system. As we all know, the goal of the Client Enrichment Series is to engage our audience in workplace topics that can contribute to the mission, success, and effective management of your real estate and workplace programs. Thank you again for coming, and have